Hey friends, today I want to start by talking about some things that jazz education gets wrong. I'm going to start just by playing some music. All right. Well, jazz is fun, and jazz is hard. Like there's no two ways around that. Jazz is really fun and jazz is really hard. And teaching jazz is fun and hard. Learning jazz can be really fun and really hard. But I think that there's room for a contemporary critique of jazz education, especially after the kind of influx of MRI studies that happened in the last couple decades and the increased understanding of music education, effective learning, best practices in that context of how people learn. So I'd like to do two things right now in the next 20 minutes or so. One is share with you three key critiques that I have, and then share with you some of a paper that I wrote during my doctoral degree. Just some excerpts from that I think will help you understand where I'm coming from as a teacher, and some of my aspirations for kind of us as a community of jazz educators and anybody who's really trying to learn effectively in this world. So one of the things that I think jazz educators get wrong is this idea that you just can't teach whatever. Right? I think that gets applied to expressiveness, gets applied to creativity. You just can't teach creativity. You just can't teach things like imagination or even interaction sometimes. Now, look, every learner and every human body and brain and combination of genetics and biology and nature and nurture has their own kind of constraints and proclivities. And of course, everybody has their own kind of desires and ambitions and a combination of what they've absorbed in their lifetime. And so this is not a statement to say that you can teach everybody exactly the same things in exactly the same way. But the idea that you just can't teach these inner experiences, I believe, is just fundamentally wrong. I know it seems hard sometimes, and it's easier to just teach the outer stuff that we can assess with a right and wrong, right? We give a worksheet, we put notes on the page, say, create these notes, and fill in the blanks, or what exactly is a 2/5 in this key, etc. And we can say that's right or that's wrong. But jazz needs to be just as much inner experience as it is outer experience. And I know that seems harder to teach, but thinking, feeling, planning, strategizing, acknowledging the inner experience in the moment, and letting go of things, shifting awareness consciously. These are all very important experiences in improvisation in particular, and in jazz in the field. Anything that you can articulate, like I just articulated a whole list of things, right, can be studied and experimented on. And anything that can be studied and experimented on can be facilitated, right? The experience of that study and that experiment can be facilitated, and therefore you can integrate it into your teaching. How do we access a feeling, right? Everybody can do that. And then try to make music that matches that feeling. Are we all going to do it in the same way? No, absolutely not. But can we provide examples? Can we provide a vehicle that's level appropriate for a student to express a certain kind of feeling? Yes, absolutely, 100%. How do we be creative? Well, creativity happens from strategic thinking applied. And that way it's not in an exact box, but it's following a certain big idea. So can we teach somebody to be creative in exactly the same way we are? No. But can we unlock their ability to think strategically and then apply that strategy in the real flow of music and therefore be creative? Yes, absolutely. Yes, we can. How do we teach somebody to be interactive, right? Can we facilitate a listening experience where they actually we're making sure that they're aware of what's happening? Were you aware of that? No? Let's go back and do it again. Listen, right? And actually facilitate that listening awareness experience, and then the response, right? The intentional response after listening and becoming aware of what somebody's doing. The intentional experience of playing something and leaving space and physically looking at another player and inviting them to respond, right? Creating interaction with motivic development. These are all things that we can facilitate and as teachers. Imagination, right? Imagination is very similar to creativity in the sense that we're applying, but imagination, I think, often was a little bit more like tinkering too, right? How can you apply your creative imagination to this? So, well, what aspect could you tinker with as you're applying a strategy? I could tinker with the permutation of this. I could tinker with the register of this applied on my instrument. I could tinker with dynamics. And in that way, we create those gateways into imagination. And that's real. That's not something that you can't teach. Okay. Number 2, theory as a prerequisite. This is one of my biggest pet peeves of all music education, regardless of style, especially in jazz, because our thinking is so important. And we ruin it for people by creating theory as a prerequisite. And it depends on how much theory, right? But there have been generations of jazz education now that have proposed massive mounds of theory as prerequisite to expertise. I want to read from my paper here. So the prerequisite paradigm, as I call it, is problematic for two reasons. One, overloading the brain with formal knowledge. Okay, formal knowledge being the knowledge that you have to take in and learn and that you can speak, right, and write down. That overload of formal knowledge leads to a novice mind where it's like, what note goes on this chord? Right? And in that novice mind, you're calculating and you're trying to do the math as you go. It can be overwhelming. It's unrealistic. And worst of all, it's discouraging. Okay, now, two, the tools, okay, this is like the prerequisite. The idea here is that we're giving you the tools, but the tools are actually a secondary aspect of jazz. They're there to serve the primary aspect, which is the actual experience of improvising creatively and playing effectively in the idiom. Okay, so the tools serve the experience. Okay, so we don't use all the tools in every experience. We just use a tiny amount of tools in most experience. So when we prerequisite tons of tools, we're actually front loading with a secondary priority. The tools should be in service of the primary priority, which is the experience. All right, and to be clear, I'm not criticizing educators for giving students the tools. Okay, what I'm suggesting is that the tools should be learned as directed approximations of the end goal. Directed approximations of the end goal, the actual experience of experts. Okay, the good stuff, the actual experience of experts. I'm going to continue reading here. So when a student learns repertoire, it's repertoire on which they can attain ease and facility because experts play with ease and facility. When a student listens to a classic recording, they learn applicable devices, they explore appropriate places to use it, and practice generalizing and varying it in their improvisation because this is what experts do. All right, this is what experts do, is the defining phrase underlying an effective learning process. This is what experts do. I've witnessed expert improvisers eloquently talk about how they think in big musical ideas and practice to attain a level of instrumental execution where they don't have to think about it when they play. But I cringe when I hear them say, it takes a long time to be able to do that, because it undergirds this underlying assumption that in order to become an expert, one must accumulate all of the knowledge and all the skills that every expert has. Okay, and to some extent that is true, right? To become a master level expert. But what's the real goal here? What's the real goal? I suggest that the immediate goal is not to become a jazz expert, right? But rather, especially for students, okay? But to experience improvising enjoyably. Joy in improvisation. For that, you don't actually need all the knowledge and the skill of an expert. It's possible to have an authentic experience of effective and enjoyable improvisation as a student of any level, and any great jazz teacher will tell you that. They will tell you things like, just play one note, just play three notes, right? And they'll teach you how to play in phrases that feel like you're saying something, how to use space in a way that is conversational, how to listen to what's happening and to stay in the form and to feel the groove, and then to use your ideas creatively, etc., etc. Okay, if the intention is to teach learners to improvise, then the methods, no matter what level of student they're aimed at, should guide students as effectively as possible through successful approximations of the end goal. And the activities should embody as effectively as possible the actual experience of experts. Okay, so theory as a prerequisite? No. Experience as the primary goal. Okay. Third critique here, misunderstanding motivation. We just do not have a clear social agreement on the nature of motivation yet, unfortunately. And we just don't get taught this stuff in history, social studies, English, all of our regular classes as we go through school. I didn't get taught this stuff until my doctoral degree in my 30s. And I was like, wow, cool. I think I've heard of some of this stuff and maybe read it in my kind of popular science books. But man, to really understand, the nature of motivation and the various studies that have been done on it really gives you an insight into a lot of things, but how we learn and why we don't learn. And look, if you have the wrong goals, you're going to wind up with the wrong assessment. All right. And so this is so important for education. We have this miscalculation over time that you start at a novice level. Okay, we'll start here. You start at a novice level, you become an aspirant as you practice some, then eventually become an amateur level, pro level, and then like expert, master, jazz level, right? And that's just a clean, practice and practice and practice. Takes time. It takes so much time and so much practice and so much, many, many years of experience. Okay, on a certain level, that's true if you're trying to become the true Jedi Master jazz level, right? But what are the components of the experience of expertise? Now, those can be approximated and facilitated, all right, at any level of student. So there's also like a wrong expectation involved here that teachers often have. They don't understand that at a novice or an aspirant level, in early development of complex skills, there's less resilience and less self-confidence. So we've got to structure our goals and activities for students in a way to create success. And success in what, right? Not just like participation trophies, but like success in the approximation of expertise, okay? Experience the real components of the experience that expert jazz improvisers have. Now, student success is directly linked to how teachers organize their sequence of activities, right? Experiences. Activities are experiences, right? So as educators, we've got to think about this stuff. So that's my 3 critiques of jazz education. Now, I'd like to read to you guys a little bit from my paper and break down a little bit more what I see as the experience of expertise and how to teach for it. So, for expert improvisers, abstract thinking initiates the skillful execution of meaningful musical expressions. In other words, expert improvisers tend to think in big ideas when they play. Okay, generating expectations and expressing feelings with their note choices, paraphrasing a jazz great from the past, creating tension and release with their phrasing, developing an idea through repetition and variation, etc., etc. On the contrary, inexperienced improvisers seem to be thinking note to note, okay, chord to chord, trying to plug in the right formula at the right time. Because execution of skills is not automatic yet for less experienced players, improvising requires conscious mental processing. And there's a very limited amount of information that the conscious processing brain, i.e. working memory, can handle. Okay, and this is a problem. When they need it most, developing jazz players are unable to think about the big ideas driving the music. Rather, they're mired in the details. Okay, in a related line of research, functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI studies of jazz pianists improvising has shown areas of the prefrontal cortex that typically mediate self-monitoring and conscious volitional control. Okay, prefrontal cortex, and this is very similar to like working memory, being deactivated during improvisation. Deactivated during improvisation. Okay, that was a study by Lim and Braun in 2008. Berkowitz and Ansari in 2010 also had a similar study using fMRI on improvisers and found specific deactivation in the right temporoparietal junction in the brain for musicians as opposed to non-musicians, resulting in inhibition of stimulus-driven attention. Okay, just like consciously paying attention to details, allowing for a more goal-directed, aka big ideas, goal-directed performance state that aids in creative thought. Okay, these results appear to affirm the theory that expert jazz improvisers are engaged in abstract thinking more than the kind of thinking that requires conscious information processing. All right, moving on. We, jazz educators, we want students to be expressing deeply through improvisation, right? To be reaching into their well of human experience and sharing their unique perceptions and interpretations and inspirations with others through their music. The ability to absorb, retain, and access meaningful musical knowledge, coupled with the ability to consciously create responses, affective responses with musical devices, right? To be consciously, intentionally expressive is what I'm saying, makes improvisation the fascinating, exciting, and emotionally rich experience that it can and should be for performers and listeners. Okay, now, it's long been established that attentional capacity, also referred to as working memory, is limited in retaining to only a handful or so pieces of information at a time. Okay? In my paper, I cited a paper from a study from 1956. That's how long we're talking about, right? That has been well established. Okay, learners develop the ability to function efficiently in increasingly complex domains by chunking bits of information. Now, that's a key thing for us to understand as educators. We have to chunk little bits of information. So you pile on a bunch of prerequisites. How are you going to chunk, right? You've got to actually help learners piece things together in manageable chunks. Experts in any domain of complex skill have automatized motor actions. Sometimes this is referred to as muscle memory, right? And developed corresponding neural pathways that activate at the mere thought of those skills in action. There was a big review of literature on expert performance in the late 90s that shed light on a history of research in various disciplines, including chess, physics, music, and more, all of which point to a characteristic mental adaptation by experts that enables pattern-based retrieval of memory, big chunks rather than little details, right? This adaptation allows for the efficient processing of incoming information and near simultaneous response in performance. Okay, so we're laying the groundwork for understanding expert experience, right? Expert improvisers, as trumpet great Terence Blanchard described in a masterclass, are ideally free from worrying about execution, having internalized the fundamentals of jazz theory and instrumental technique, and consequently are free to think in big musical ideas while improvising. Improvisers like Blanchard may most often be thinking in the way that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi describes in his book Flow. Right? Experts in any field, Csikszentmihalyi proposes, when deeply engrossed in a skillful experience, reach a state of optimal experience. Optimal experience. I love this term. Their minds focus intensely on the task at hand, but without stress and strain. They lose track of time sometimes and often experience a disembodied consciousness, a metacognition, in which they are witnessing their bodies execute skills seemingly automatically. Okay, so teaching for automaticity, for chunking information, and thinking strategically. Now, overall, the picture emerging from the scholarship in improvisation shows that the thinking process of improvisers necessitates efficiency. Automatized or proceduralized motor skills combined with conceptual chunking, mitigating the cognitive load of improvising and allowing improvisers to maintain that attentional capacity needed to monitor and evaluate input and near simultaneously initiate meaningful musical output. Okay, an improviser's capacity for attention is a crucial factor in their success. And there are just so many things that we're thinking about, so many. Everything from who's in the audience to what does my hand feel like to what happened, what I eat, what happened in the world today. Contextual constraints create a load on attentional capacity. In many ways, contextual constraints are positive, right? Historical, political, cultural levels. Contextual constraints are the stories like embedded in the development of jazz in America, the story of the struggle for freedom, the story of a melting pot society. They're the roots of stylistic variations, Afro-Cuban, Brazilian jazz, fusion, etc. On a social and interpersonal level, contextual constraints are more tangible. Right? The size and the makeup of a local scene, venue, audience, and the attitude and awareness of bandmates. On a personal level, contextual constraints, conscious and unconscious, include physical and emotional well-being, stylistic preferences, instrumental proclivity, and skill level, for better and worse. Right? On a musical level, this could be tempo, meter, all manner of formal structural components. Okay, all of these contextual factors promise to influence the direction of an improviser's attention and, of course, threaten to overload it. Right? So it's prudent for us to consider the huge importance of these both covert and overt constraints, right? The things we see and the things we don't, but we know they're there. Right? We jazz educators, we have to deal with the fact that the process of making note choices and initiating motor skills that produce sounds on an instrument is not the whole picture. Okay, whether tackling the note choice, physical execution, or contextual aspects of an improviser's experience and development, the goal that educators will do well to keep in mind is for the improviser to maintain enough attentional capacity to intentionally and expressively propel his or her performance forward through the music. Okay. I would love to hear your experiences of learning, teaching, performing, when you were able to access the experience of expertise, those components of expertise of playing from big ideas, of entering a flow state, of being expressive, interactive, creative, imaginative, and whether you were a true jazz master Jedi or just an aspirant working on basic skills, but having a well-facilitated lesson or combo or jam session where you actually were able to really experience that and have it be enjoyable, right? Where this music, jazz in particular, improvised music, actually gave you joy, not just overwhelm and stress, because jazz is hard and jazz is fun. All right, how's that for full circle? All right, y'all, take care, and I'll see you next time.